in 2004, a few years after Yugoslavia fell apart and was no more, and the war ended, I got an opportunity to go study in the United States, and I took it. And I ended up in Texas, of all places. I wasn't prepared for Texas. It was a real cultural shock. So it's 2004, and I find myself in hot, humid land of Texas. The land of Tex-Mex food, fast and enormous trucks, and bad bread. At least that's how I was. I didn't know where the good bread was at this time. And I'm in Texas A&M University, which is a very interesting place for someone like myself. In these first days that I was there, I continuously got asked where I was from. I was instantaneously recognized as the thing out of place. And I didn't really know how to answer that because the place that I was from was no more. How do you tell people that you're from a place that no longer exists? But it was also incredibly freeing because as a neurodivergent person, I didn't really get to ask all the obvious questions that everybody else knew the answer to while growing up. But here in Texas, I'm a cultural oddity. And folks assume that the reason why I'm asking these questions is because I'm from this different culture. And so it gave me license to ask questions that I never dare ask where I was from. Things like, how do you make friends? Things like, how do you communicate with people and use small talk without sounding awkward? People were quite patient with me in that sense. I was in a communication program, and the reasoning behind applying for the communication program really was that in my family, in my culture, in all of my ancestral lineages, there's so much trauma, and people are so poor and so economically disadvantaged. We learn to live without electricity, without running water, without toilet paper, especially during the sanctions. And there is this almost, I would call it pressure to find a well-paid career. And there is no time for frivolous things like storytelling and writing and art making, all the things that meant life to me. And so I was looking for something that was adjacent to writing and storytelling, but it was still a sensible way of being in the world. It was a sensible, potentially well-paid career. And I looked through the Texas A&M list of classes and departments, and I thought, communication sounds like it could be that thing. And so I went for communication, but I really, honestly, I'm so sorry, my dear professors, I was really not into it. I suffered through it. I got an MA in communication and I got a PhD in communication, but it was really never my life's blood. It was really never my passion. Writing and storytelling were. And so being the great trickster, not only of other people, but myself, I managed to talk myself into just continuing with this program, but at the same time, taking every creative writing class and every anthropology class that was offered at Texas A&M. And during one of these writing courses that I took, I got to work with Professor Larry Heineman, who was a visiting artist and who was a Vietnam vet and who knew what PTSD was and who knew what trauma was and who was quite brilliant in his own way and who could see people. He could look at you and kind of see a glimmer of your soul. And I remember at this time, like every good student, I was trying to emulate other great artists. That's what you're told when you're studying art, that you need to learn from the greats. And you first need to learn what other amazing artists did before you can develop your own style. And so I was trying, like the magpie that I was and still am, to imitate other writers. I didn't have a voice yet. I didn't know what my voice was. And there was so much about myself that I was deeply ashamed of. And they can really, really stand in the way of your voice, that lack of self-acceptance and self-love. So I was ashamed of where I was from. I was ashamed of not fitting in and not really aligning with that culture. I was ashamed, without knowing, of being neurodivergent. I didn't have a word for that. I was ashamed of being weird. I was ashamed of being an immigrant. I was ashamed of being brown. I was ashamed of having an accent. I was ashamed of the fact that I was still learning English and how to communicate in it. And there were so many things that made me want to hide and made me want to reject and amputate parts of myself. And I think that Larry saw that, and he also saw the potential of these hidden parts. And I remember we had a writing contest that came up at the end of the class, and he encouraged all the students in the class to submit their work to this contest. And we did a lot of exercises. We wrote a lot of stories. I think I probably wrote 5 short stories during this class. And one of our assignments was to write a folktale. And I remember that I didn't have time. This was during finals. I had other classes that were in some, I thought at the time, more important. And I really, really, really didn't want to write this folktale. And I procrastinated until the last minute. And then I sat down in despair. And I ended up writing one of the old Serbian stories that my grandmother used to tell me, because that was the first thing that came to my mind. It was about a peacock queen who's a shapeshifter and who can shift between a bird and a woman. And at the time, I thought, I wish I could come up with something better than this. But there was no time. I didn't have any other ideas. And so I wrote this story. I retold this story. And when the time came for us to submit our work to the contest, Larry had a conference with each of us, and he made suggestions on which story was our strongest story. And I remember sitting across from him, and he told me, listen, I don't know what you're going to do. I can't tell you what to do. But your best story is that folktale. And I thought, this man is insane. He doesn't know what he's talking about. That's my worst story. I will never submit that to a contest. Who would want to read that? It's an obscure folktale from an obscure culture, the Dark Balkans. I don't want to emphasize the fact that I come from this place that's been orientalized and called all kinds of names, that doesn't belong and is not seen as a part of Europe. I want to be seen as enlightened. I didn't have the words or the language for that, but I now realize I wanted to pass for white, and I couldn't. Clearly, I was failing at it, but I was still desperately trying to do it. And I submitted a different story. I decided to ignore Larry Heinemann's sage advice. And then lo and behold, years later, this is what I write.